This is Duke University.
Let us move to our discussant, who is Professor Lynn, who's Associate Professor of Hungarian Studies and the Director of Graduate Studies at the Department of Central Eurasian Studies at Indiana University, and she has also adjunct appointments in Indiana University's Departments of Musicology and Ethnomusicology. And her book, Redefining Hungarian Music from Lists to Bartók, came out in 2013 with Oxford, and she has published also in numerous other journals. Beginning in 2000, she was doing fieldwork in both, she has been doing since then, fieldwork in both Europe and North America on Hungarian folk and popular music, focusing on the role of Romani performers. And she's currently drafting a book on the transformation of Roma music in 20th century Hungary, based on oral history interviews and archival research. Professor Hooker, please.
And that is this question, scholarship or advocacy? This is not initially my question. It was a question I was asked last Friday when I presented a paper proposing a revised history of what I call the Hungarian gypsy music industry at a musicology forum. The audience and the presenter, for that matter, were all non-Roma. Many of my sources were, in my view, pretty conventional, selections from the press, government documents, others for historical musicologists, less conventional, interviews, and for that matter, Facebook would be considered, again, less conventional. But somehow, my take on this topic provoked this question, scholarship or advocacy. I, at the risk of making it about me, came to study topics related to Roma through my dissertation research on the early career of composer Béla Bartók, specifically the debate about what Hungarian music was and should be and where he fell in that. Certain things about Bartók's writings with reference to race, to the race of gypsies specifically, and that is the word that he used, made me uncomfortable. And as I discussed my discomfort with one of my advisors, he urged me not to shy away from what made me uncomfortable, but to run toward it. What I found that it was impossible to understand the concept of Hungarian national music without taking the role of Romani musicians and so-called gypsy music into account. So is noticing it scholarship or advocacy? I have pursued research teasing apart the roles of rural and urban Romani musicians in folk and popular musics through fieldwork and historical documents, and I wanted to understand this sphere from the point of view mostly of the Romani musicians themselves. I do not want to pretend that I fully understand that point of view, especially, not only am I not a Romani musician, I haven't spent enough time with them, but that has always been my aim, is trying to emphasize that perspective, scholarship or advocacy. As a teacher at Indiana University, I've offered a course on Roma history and culture for about 10 years. My appointment at IU is in Hungarian studies, though with these other affiliations, you've got lots of studies there in my list already in the bio. And when I first announced this course, a retired faculty member in my department circulated a letter protesting that my course might lead to an international disgrace by propagating the idea that gypsies and Hungarians are the same thing. Fortunately, my other colleagues basically ignored him. And of course, one of the tasks of the course was to explore the complexities of Roma identity. But another task that I've devoted more and more space to as I've developed it over time is making sure my students, almost all undergraduates, understand the depth of the crisis or multiple crises facing Romani communities throughout Europe and, for that matter, the world, and the challenges faced by those seeking to implement change on a personal or community level. When assigning readings to my students, when leading discussions, should I emphasize the scholarship or the advocacy? My spontaneous answer to this questioner last Friday was, of course, that what I do and what we all do can be both. Moreover, there's a long tradition of scholarship in Romani studies, going back at least to the 18th century, that demonizes Roma. Heinrich Grellmann's discussion of the linguistic links of Romani between Romani and Indic languages is framed by accusations of sexual deviance, cannibalisms, and the like. more recently, and on a much milder level, a prominent Hungarian scholar of Romani music felt it necessary to describe his research subjects as Hungary's alien itinerants. They have been there for centuries, but still. And stated that the music played and liked by gypsies is, quote, only their music in the sense in which the Hungarian spoken by them is their language, close quote. Another Hungarian-born scholar, a political scientist working in the United States, felt compelled to include in the introduction to his book on East European gypsies and their political evolution since in the late 20th century, the statement that he did not particularly like Roma. To be fair, he also said he did not particularly dislike them either. And this is even before we mention such less sophisticated kinds of orientalizing or distancing, like the book Gypsy Sorcery and Fortune-Telling by Charles Godfrey Leland, one of the founding members of the Gypsy Lore Society, and other publications that claim to make scholarly proclamations on such magical capabilities. So I argued to my questioner, in this context, this kind of material deserves a counterweight. And beyond the world of academic texts, the simple awareness of current events, of the blonde angel case, of the murders in rural Hungary of a few years ago, how can we not include some level of advocacy in our scholarship? Everyone on this panel is an outstanding example of this. Roma and non-Roma in courts of asylum seekers hearings and in the art galleries of Europe and the United States and the United Nations. And I am really, again, in awe and privileged to be able to comment on that. And thank you again. That's it.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. We are now open for discussion, and what I would request is that unless you have already been identified or labeled, that you identify yourself without essentializing. A particular moment, your identity at a particular moment in history, a very fragile one, always in a process. Identify yourself all the same as you present your question. The floor is open. Please.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Nidhi Trehan. I'm also going to be speaking soon. Yeah, this is actually for Carol Silverman. Quick question. You had mentioned when you were talking about some of the Romani performers and how many of them had, been marginalized from the national cultures. However, in two examples, two countries, and I'm sure maybe you already know this, or maybe someone has posed a similar question in some previous forum. I'm now thinking of Spain and Hungary, because you have the Sáztagú Cigán Orchestra, right? The 100-member Gypsy Orchestra band, which actually became a national symbol, was sent to far-flung places like Australia to represent the Hungarian nation. It's a wonderful example of maybe how the state appropriated Romani talent and then put it out there for global consumption in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. So, I mean, I just thought maybe you could, and we have a lot of Hungarians in the room, so please, if you can identify what was going on. And then secondly, the case of flamenco. Clearly, when people think of Spanish culture today, the first thing that pops in their mind is flamenco. Flamenco, music, dance. It's become so enmeshed with the national Spanish culture, at least that's my perception, I could be wrong. I thought maybe we could talk about these two examples. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. You're right that always Hungary and Spain are used as examples where Romani culture has been taken in and actually become national culture. But it's actually a lot more complicated, both in Hungary and Spain. So Spain, for example, applied to UNESCO to recognize flamenco as a masterpiece of intangible cultural heritage. And their first application, which was several years ago, never even mentioned Gitanos. So you have erasures even while you're taking and appropriating into national culture, you have erasures. And these are the kinds of things that I really think need to be studied. In Hungary, Lynn has written quite a lot about this, of what has been taken from Hungary, from Romani culture, and actually labeled Hungarian, or debated about what is actually Hungarian about it, or what is Romani about it. And maybe Lynn can expand on that. So it's never as simple as using Spain and Hungary just because these became part of national culture. There's actually a politics of that. And actually, Spain did not get the masterpiece status until they included Gitanos in, but it still is not that simple, because basically many people see this as Spanish culture. There's a lot of debates in Spain that there may be a tiny historical portion that's due to Gitanos, but it's also about the Moors, and it's about the Jews, and it's Spanish folk culture. And it is a multicultural form. However, it is interesting how erasures happen and why they happen. Do you want to say anything about Hungary?
Well, first of all, with respect to the Száz-tagú, the 100-member Gypsy Orchestra, it's a little bit, this is a very big topic. That particular orchestra was founded in 1985 as the Roma musicians in many of the state folk ensembles were being pushed out in the name of authenticity and being replaced by non-Roma revivalists. This was after decades of yes, the stake folk ensemble, the army ensemble, and the Royko Gypsy Orchestra of the Communist Youth League being sent far and wide. Yes. Yes, and you know, the Royko particularly, I've spoken to several of their former members, and they, you know, some of them said they played at Saddam Hussein's son's wedding, and then they got stuck there because of the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq war. I mean, then they were sent to Japan. They were sent to really very widely traveled in the name of Hungarian culture. Even though the dancers were largely non-Roma, but the occasional singers, but all of the musicians, as far as I can tell, were Roma, and this was very well understood within the Hungarian context, and much less so by their non-Hungarian audience. And this was also the existence of this ensemble used as a reason not to establish an ensemble to promote Romani language ensembles in Hungary in the 50s or 60s. So it becomes, you know, what is the role of that language in Hungarian culture was another aspect. This is work in progress, so I don't want to overstay my time.
I would just add that, you know, there's other places we can look for this exact kind of thing. My friend Steve Lee is working on France and gypsy jazz, and it's also very complicated. And you just really, I think, tend to have countries doing what's convenient, you know, and even with the two women I was talking about, one of them is such a major export of the Czech Republic, but isn't coded as Romani, and I think there's a good reason why she doesn't code herself and isn't coded as Romani, because it's not convenient in that context.
I'm Julia Salai. I will speak in the next panel, but this exciting story of the Hungarian member Gypsy Orchestra, I think, is a little bit more complicated, or at least it seems that recently it has got a turn which is quite significant. The first is that state support, financial support, was heavily cut back for the orchestra. Second, it became ghettoized in a sense that this is the representative institution of Hungarian culture, much more adding to it that it's a Roma-Hungarian representation than before, when it was Hungarianized, and in this sense it was integral. So at the moment it's unclear, at least for me, whether that's a lasting trend, that all those supports which it got for inclusion are withdrawn now politically and financially as well. So we have to see that, I think.
I want to thank Timea Junghaus, especially because you talked about visual art and kind of broke us out of some, when we're talking about Romani art, the tendency to kind of default back into music and dance. But that brought up for me the question of poetry and also vanguardism and, you know, the visual art examples that you showed us, half of them, did, you know, they were quite direct in their reframing of dialogues and of images. And so I did think of how poetry, when I was in Hungary in the 1990s, that was really that, you know, Romani poetry was really like that. So I have a kind of a question about that, you know, what about the, you know, literature in all of this? And my own reflection would be, I feel like literature infuses so much of, if we're talking about European culture in a way that, you know, in the United States it doesn't. And it just keeps coming up in many different ways, although I feel like it's kind of throttled itself back in the recent past. So that's my comment, and I invite the panelists to respond.
Yes, and I invite everyone else from the Hungarian cultural sphere to answer, because I'm not a literary expert, but I think it's a very important comment because, for example, the famous discovery by art historians of the first Roma visual artist János Balázs is exactly at the same time as Menyhért Lakatos's Lakatos, his first book is coming out. Can't think of the title, I don't know. In English, Color of Smoke. Color of Smoke, yes, is the book of Menyhért Lakatos. So I think, first of all, it's very important that, you know, Hungary has played a very important role, you know, in bringing these intellectuals into the mainstream European discourse, and it's a real shame that, you know, while our Roma intellectuals and activists were really making making Roma visual art and Roma art as an important Hungarian discourse on the European stage in the beginning, we are absolutely not participating, you know, the progressive discourse any longer, and mainstream curators, you know, are basically directing the Roma art scene, and non-Roma curators as well. So Hungary could not benefit from its position in the 1960s of leading position, and there is a lot of literary connections, of course, as you mentioned, not just in the beginning, but throughout the story of Roma art.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful for this very rich panel's presentation. So we started with history, which is a very important component in identity making. And Carol Silverman was talking about the essentializing culture, how it can be used or misused by Roma and non-Roma. And you were talking about the visual representation of Roma, as well as how can we decolonize these kinds of visual representations, right, as a Roma artist and theories. And I really like Petra was talking about the therapeutic part, which is very much using culture as an instrument for identity making and healing process. So I have several questions, actually, what I would like to pose. The first to David Crow, and about the Romanian history. So you were talking about something which is very specific and very much connected to the Romanian Roma history. So it's basically the slavery. And what is your thought on that how slavery is actually impacted or made an impact on Roma culture or Roma identity? What would you attribute to that specific historical moment?
Well, the other thing, if you look at Roma all over Eastern Europe, I mean, you have this, oh, sorry, I'll learn. Is that, that's better. On one hand, you would think, and it's really not been studied, I mean, I studied the institution of Roma slavery very much, and then in my own mind did a paper another year comparing the African American institution of slavery to the Roma institution. And then having worked with other Roma communities in other part of Eastern Europe, what I've not been able to do is determine how that specifically affected Roma. In other words, the plight of the Roma historically has been varying degrees of bad or worse. And what I can't, in my own mind, I cannot honestly say in my own mind that because of Roma slavery in Romania, that their plight is any worse. In other words, the stereotypes and everything that have followed them, you find all over Eastern Europe. So in that sense, I mean, I'd like to be able to say there was something distinctive. But I think when you're dealing with communities of Roma all over Eastern Europe, they've been treated so badly, both legally, socially, economically, whatever, that regardless of, say, the fact that the Roma were enslaved for centuries and centuries and centuries, the Roma have been so oppressed so deeply that there reaches a point where just the stigmas, the stereotypes run so deep that being a slave or not being a slave, I mean, they are at the like I said, at the bottom of the bottom rung of the socioeconomic ladder. And that is, but in the case of Romania, that's still, in other words, do the prejudices in Romania run any deeper than in, say, in Hungary or the Czech Republic or things like that? Yes and no. I mean, it varies according, I think one thing about Romania is if you look at if you compare, say, from 1864 when Roma slaves were emancipated, and there was quite a national movement for that. They were simply really caught up in this whole emancipation phenomena sweeping Europe and even affected the United States. I think one thing that might make it different is that if you look at, say, the history of the Czech Republic, the history of Hungary, and things like that, Romanian peasants traditionally, historically, because Romania was traditionally a fairly poor country after, say, it was created in the 1850s, 1860s, that the level of the peasant and the Roma were not that much different. The Roma were just something convenient for very poor, desperate Romanian peasants to look down on. And then if you fast forward to today and look at where Romania is as an economy and things like that, what you have is you have in other words, for example, Romanian politicians today, one of the barriers that to Romanian Roma progress is the fact that Romanian politicians find it very convenient, particularly after the tsunami hit Romania and the rest of Europe in 2009. You'll find that politicians openly admit it's a kiss of death politically if you bring up the Roma issue. Well, the point I'm trying to make is part of what affects contemporary attitudes towards Roma in Romania is the fact that it is not a particularly well-off or particularly sophisticated society. Not that there aren't many sophisticated people in Romania, don't get wrong, but the economy's in such back. And economic issues I tend to fortify and dredge up. So in case in Slovakia and Romania, we'll probably have a lot to compare to. But on the other hand, you could make a case for the fact that in Hungary and the Czech Republic, the dynamics of prejudice is different, in part driven by the sophistication of the societies. In other words, in certain ways, the level of hatred, in other words, the difference between a poor Romanian peasant and poor Romanian living on the edge of society in Romania might be quite different than, say, the same group of Roma living in the Czech Republic or living in Hungary, which are more sophisticated and more economically prosperous countries. I don't think that, if that makes any sense or not.
I have a question to Carol Silverman. I really, really liked your paper, and I I really like the way as you deconceptualize or deconstructed essentialism. And one of your last words, actually, I'm not sure that I'm going to quote you in a bright way, but it would be too dangerous or risky, both rejecting essentialism and embracing hybridity, right? And I think this is very important, particularly in these days when we try to apply some very postmodern theories such as superdiversity or from Bradiotti to nomadism. So what is your thoughts on that? Would it be so dangerous to embrace all these theoretical concepts?
This is dangerous. I think theories tend to be quite fashionable in academia. There are really periods of kind of adopting new words when actually the old vocabulary is just fine. We don't really need them. The concept of super diversity, although I'm not that familiar with it, I don't find it that different from intersectionality. Although I think Vertovitz used it more in the UK migration concept as a kind of critique of multiculturalism, which is, again, a different topic. But I think if we're actually going to look at more categories than, feminists who invented intersectionality wanted to broaden the concept of gender to include race first, according to Kimberly Crenshaw's conceptualization of intersectionality, and later to open up gender analysis to class analysis, sexuality, and other types of things. That, I think, is still a very useful framework. But the newest work on intersectionality, I think we don't need a new term like superdiversity, although it may be useful for the European context of looking at the failure of multiculturalism. But intersectionality, any framework is going to move and open up and expand. So new work on intersectionality is basically about not adding categories, but actually how the categories intersect with each other in what means on the ground experientially. So whereas the first phase of like a new theory is a new word and a new conceptualization of how do categories intersect, now we're looking at actually on the ground, how do different experiences respond to an intersectional analysis? What can an intersectional analysis do? I would say the same thing would be true of essentialism or hybridity or any conceptual framework. We have to see how it's being used by various positioned actors in the political field on the ground. And for Roma, I mean, I think it's really important because Roma have for so many years been defined and how could I say, managed by non-Roma. So we have to see how Roma are using some of the same terminology, perhaps in different ways, but perhaps actually adopting very essentialist terminology or adopting hybridity or intersectionality. I mean, it's like a laboratory in progress. So I certainly don't want to either valorize or demonize essentialism or hybridity, but point out where each of them might be useful on the ground in various political fields. And I think only very kind of grassroots and ethnographic cases on the ground can show us what these words and concepts are doing at particular moments. So I don't have a flag to wave or anything, but I'm cautioning against either adopting or throwing out older concepts in the favor of newer and more fashionable concepts. Yeah.
Hi. Okay, it's on. My name is Christina Bejan, and I'm a research scholar in the Center for European Studies here at Duke, thanks to Malachi and Amy. But my actual job is in Washington, D.C. at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Durham is my hometown, so it's nice to be here. Okay, my question is actually for everybody. I was really excited to hear the first two speakers Thank you for bringing up the African American experience. And the reason that I am bringing this up is that when Angela and I first met at her Ratziu Prize ceremony, she won a really important award. If you are not aware, the Democracy Award at the Woodrow Wilson Center. This was about a year and a half ago. Woo. Yeah. And so that's where we first met. And Angela was on this. Yeah. So. And she was the star of the evening in the panel speaking about Roma rights. And the representative of the Open Society, New York City, actually said, well, Roma rights has nothing to learn from civil rights, so why are we talking about it? Oh yeah. And I'm bringing this up just to say I'm so happy the two of you did, and I think that there's more to say. We have 2 days, and we are in the heartland of where that would really, really matter. And I was wondering, I know we have more time, but just for now, the performance arts and also visual arts speakers, if you could speak to that. So Timea, when I was looking at your photographs, if we all remember the black hoodie discussion of Florida Trayvon Martin and how young people shouldn't wear hoodies, right? And unfortunately, there's still a lot of pressure to not dress like that because that's bad. I make the effort to wear a hoodie a lot. So my question is for you, do you feel like there's a parallel and can the Roma community learn from that? And then so for Petra, the same thing goes for music in terms of African American music that, as we know, is exceptionally popular in this country. So I could go on, but that's my question. Thank you.
Well, on the music front, I mean, as you can imagine, there isn't a short answer to this, but yes, and I guess the shortest answer is that there are, there has been a growing number of Romani musicians who feel themselves in alliance with African American musicians, and they're using that both conceptually, sometimes. It might be just conceptual where they're aware of that, but their music doesn't necessarily reflect it. But many times it's both. So they take the concept of resistance. They take kind of hip hop culture in, I think, a productive understanding of it, and then they will use elements of hip hop music and culture with or without kind of syncretizing it. I mean, any other music people, feel free to chime in with recognizably Romani musics. And then it has various effects, I would say, in-group and then projecting to out-group. At its best, you have somebody who has a clear message. They are able to kind of mobilize, people within their own community and also to project that message in a way that makes sense to outsiders. We had, in the Czech Republic, a promising artist by the name of Gypsy. That didn't end up going so well, but that would have been an example of yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And the second part of the question was addressed to me, and I can only tell you that examining the Roma body or the appearance and the connected stereotypes is a very recent phenomenon in visual arts, it's also important that everything that is happening in the African American context is inspirational and is important to us. It doesn't necessarily translate to the Central European context where we even have to, fight our own academics and our own fellow non-Roma researchers and supporters who were educated in a completely different historical, cultural context. And for them, post-colonial literature, African American diasporas, text, advocacy leaders, releases, even the news are not relevant. They are relevant only to us who are specifically looking for this inspiration. So we are trying to invite artists who actually almost always have the solutions and the sensitivity to work with these taboos and problems and issues. And we are working together on exhibiting these issues in a creative and transformative, transgressing way.
Could I add something? First of all, in music, there's some interesting trends in the Balkans of Roma adopting what they're calling ghetto style. So in other words, they're essentializing African American culture and then yet putting a label on themselves. And actually, some of them are from a ghetto, from Shutka, but some of them are not. But it's recognizing that the ghetto label sells. So ghetto and gypsy are now becoming synonyms in rap music groups in the Balkans who are trying to get audiences in the West. So I think that's interesting as well. There's also the phenomenon of ghetto tours, which may happen. I mean, the Council of Europe has a Romani routes initiative of a tourist map through Europe, and believe me, some of it may be ghetto tours, which some are good, some are bad, whatever. And then on the history side, I wanted to mention, to me it seems like a lot of research really needs to be done in Romania and elsewhere about the post-slavery period, because what we know from American history is that actually in the Reconstruction period was kind of some of the most damaging racist mentality making in the US. I'm sure you know about the recent Center for, I can't remember what it was, but they're making plaques to all the lynching places throughout the South and the North, by the way, or mid-Atlantic. So because this happened recently, it's not the period of slavery, and that this kind of collective memory or collective discrimination and marginalization actually does affect how people view their lives today. So, I think this is an interesting area.
Some of it I did in one of my books on the Roma, but more specifically, in 2004, 2005, at the invitation of Ian Hancock, who some of you know, we put on a year-long program with the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and it was funded by the Diplo Foundation. It was to take 25 young Roma with college degrees from different parts of Eastern Europe. Part of it was online, part of it was meetings in Geneva, and to train them over a year-long period in the diplomatic and other skills that were necessary to begin to deal, because this is at the time, the decade of Roma inclusion is the beginning. And Ian, whose wife is African American, at least he was at the time, you might be no more, he was really interested in the African American thing. He said, what tie-in is there to the Roma? He said, would you do somehow, because I was raised in Miami and was involved in the civil rights movement in the 60s, he thought I knew more than anybody else. I didn't. But then I took on a project and delivered a paper at the conference in Geneva. And then it resulted in a chapter in the book that came as a result of that. And it was really interesting to go back and look at the dynamics of African American history, Dr. King and all this and that, and do a comparison contrast. And so it is in a chapter form in the book if you really want to go very deeply into it. And it's fascinating because for me it's a touchstone, because you have to be careful with historical comparisons, so that the time frames are different, the countries they're taking place in are different, so on and so forth. But what got me into Roma studies was reading an article in a Hungarian paper in the late 1980s that talked about black Hungarians, the brown Hungarians, the blacks of Eastern Europe. I vividly remember that, and that was at the height. That was when the civil rights movement, it was written at the time the civil rights movement was going on, and in some Hungarian writers' mindset, they were getting wind of what was going on in the United States, and somehow they associated what was going on in the United States with the civil rights movement with the Roma, who of course had no rights in Hungary, but the fact was they were applying color to that. And it's very interesting because I think I concluded that the Roma don't have a Dr. King. It's also something because, yeah, and that's the point. You have many Dr. Kings, but the point is this was taking place in a single country. And the other thing that, of course, is problematic, anytime what you deal with Roma in Hungary or Romania or where else, is this monolithic mindset of the Roma. And that's a huge stumbling block, because I know in the World Bank report in 2014, talking about the problems with some of the funding and so forth coming into Roma communities, is that in Romania, the thing that you can't get across in the Imprenu in Romania talks about this. One of the Roma NGOs talks about the thing that we cannot get the Romanian government to listen to is the fact that we have wonderful examples of Roma who have benefited greatly from the decade of Roma inclusion. and that we need to sort of use these as positive examples, that the Roma are a positive resource. And they said they cannot get this through to the politicians that run the country, in large part because they are politicians. They have to go out for a re-election. And in Romania, it's the kiss of death politically in certain parts of the country if you don't get hard on the Roma question.
May I just add something really funny? I'm sorry. Just one thing. I also read this World Bank report in 2014. I was there at the prime presentation at an international large conference, and the title was Roma, the Workforce of the Future. This is the title of the World Bank's presentation. I was stunned. The workforce of the future. World Bank, 2014, launching report.
I'm Solomon Burnett. I'm an artist, activist, academic. It's always great to see the way different hierarchies play out in everyday social engagements and in the academy too. I was exceptionally pleased at the connections between African Americanity, there's a new word, and and the Roma situation. I'm a big fan of Frantz Fanon. I was wondering what type of pushback you've gotten from Europeanists and other folks in your field to the application of a set of theories, a theorist who's typically used in the Afro-Caribbean context and applying it to an explicitly European context. And also, your picture of Selma Selman, two of the pictures, one the lady had on boxing gloves and the lady seemed to have on work gloves. What was the symbolism of the gloves?
Maybe I start with the second question. The first one is Zuzana Hruskova, who is a Czech, a Slovakian artist who was educated in the Czech Republic and then moved to Kent, to the United Kingdom, and who is working with migrant families whom are there in Kent in an illegal campsite. And Zuzana, as a contemporary artist, is publishing a paper with the teenagers of the campsite, the girls, the teenage girls. She's supporting them with the technical stuff, and the girls are able to write the text and create the images. So that image was actually created by the teenage girls. It's a powerful image. There was a turn in my text saying that, you know, they kind of revolt against the dominance and turn the laws against those who have created them, or something like this. And it was an illustration as a good example for this, what happens when a Roma artist arrives to this illegal campsite and how she touches sensitively or works sensitively with the community. And Selma Salman is a video artist, actually. That is her cover picture for her website, and she's extremely provocative. And this is a still from her video, Do Not Look Into Gypsy Eyes, which again is extremely important when we think about, you know, stereotypes, you know, the stereotypes encoded in our collective cultures, and how a Roma artist can come, you know, and work with this stereotype. And this is a 5-minute video, which is actually looking straight at you from the back of this van and talks about, now if you have looked into my eyes, these are the spells that I'm putting on you, this is what could happen to you, this is the luck or the miracles that could happen to you. So she's playing with this, and it evokes a lot of emotions, strange emotions, fear, and emotions connected to all these transcendental, scary things. And it's a fantastic work that I wasn't able to show because of the limited time. And I think I shortly mentioned that our Central European academics are very conservative related to the consideration of what Central European history means. It's a very, in their view, it's isolated. It's kind of an isolated space, you know, kind of ripped off of the rest of Europe in a way that has created this specific context where this Roma situation also has to be specifically understood differently than in the rest of the European context. I think I can invite Angela and Nidhi Trehan, Dr. Nidhi Trehan, to contribute, because they have published a wonderful text that explains this more specifically.
Actually, when I was living in Hungary, I knew Angela at that time. We were both young sociologists, and we both encountered Fanon. Yeah. So, you know, especially, you know, Wretched of the Earth, his classical work, it definitely has great insight into the Romani condition. What else can I say? I don't know if Angela wants to say, you want to add something to specifically about when you read Fanon, what you understood at that time.
Yes, and I think we were looking for something what we can relate to, and Tima is already started that basically the classical Hungarian academic scholarship doesn't really talk to us. I mean, to us, I'm talking about the Romani intellectuals or scholars who are coming from a very specific context, right? So to be a first generation college graduate, first generation, anyway, so it just, we just made a huge jump from our circumstances. For example, I'm just talking about my situation, coming from a family where my parents didn't write and didn't read anything, so they were completely illiterate. So think about it, that how can you come to that point to do a PhD at Central European University, right? Which is one of the best university in Central Europe. And I just explained for Viola, I'm sorry to being so personal, but I think this tone is very important as well, that I have a feeling that I'm just running after you guys, just running and running and running. And I have a feeling I never, ever will be able to catch up. No, but really, that's how I feel, because I just feel that we know, I mean, we are educated, we study sociology, and we know that it's so hard to coming from such a family and to go to a Hungarian educational system which doesn't really tolerate Roma, and we are labeled from the very beginning, from our very early childhood, right? And I think when I started my PhD, that was the first time when I really encountered Fanon, Paul Gilroy, Spivak, and many other, Homi Bhabha, many other post-colonial theorists, and I started to make a connection with our Romani studies. And I got so many discouragement. How can I come to that? So why am I using post-colonial framework? It has nothing to do with Romani issues. It's a totally different thing. And even I was questioned, some of you were there actually at my PhD defense, right? Viola and Tima as well, and Martin, right? So, and I think one of the questions which was raised by my supervisor, that how can you apply post-colonial theory, or why you are using post-colonial theories when we know that Roma were not being colonized, right? So Roma has not been colonized as compared with some historical colony. Anyway, so of course I was prepared and I made my answer, and of course, colonization is not just territorial, right? But it's also very much like political, economical, and social control as well, and psychological control. So that's why Fanon is again so important. And I think we got so much inspiration from that, and it's a kind of spiritual, intellectual support for us to read post-colonial theory and Black American theorists as well. So African American social theorists are are just so important and relevant for many of us, right? Thanks.
So, I mean,
I just wanted to add that it seems like the racial component is also missing in Europe. There's a real refusal. I would disagree with David. I don't think the Hungarian journalist was copying America or referencing. There is racial discourse all over Europe, historical racial discourse, but in many places it really has not been examined, it's been denied. I mean, in the Caucasus, Caucasians are called blacks of Russia. I mean, it's not only Roma, but there's many racialized discourses throughout Europe historically, and European both politicians and academics are starting to look at it, but it's actually very unexplored. So if you add the post-colonial and the race, you can see why you felt like you were crazy. Yeah. It's like, you know, you're living it, and then they're telling you it doesn't exist.
Okay. And we'll have a very final question there.
Hi, thank you all for your insights. And I think my question is going to be on somewhat similar lines.
Self-essentialization.
Oh, right. So I'm Carla Hung. I'm also a research scholar for the European research scholar at Duke. And I'm a cultural anthropology doctoral student here. So my question is about, well, it's about another kind of essentialism that could potentially be strategic, and it's, I mean, in some of your talks, you were talking about neoliberalism and the role of the market in the dissemination of artistic production, and I'm wondering, not to go too far into the trope of the noble savage, but I'm wondering what kind of work or what kind of drives or impulse is there into thinking about some sort of essentialized understanding of circulation of artistic production within Romani communities that is anti-capitalist or non-capitalist, or could provide some sort of alternative to a neoliberal capitalist economic market that appropriates Romani artists into the curators, into the subject position of the curators like you were talking about, or through these mass mediated markets. And whether that has import not just for Romani communities, but also for communities outside of that world. I don't know if that, should I elaborate more? Is that somewhat?
You're asking about some maybe anti-neoliberal or anti-capitalist examples within Romani communities. Actually, I mean, I can't think of any. I mean, most Romani musicians, and you guys can help me with this, are so anxious to make a living. All they want is in. They want to get in the system. They don't want to figure out how to resist it. They want to get into the system. Now, there are resistance ways to be in. There are ways to resist and be in through, you know, texts and so on, getting more control over your artistic production rather than handing it over to non-Romani managers. But can you think of any projects that are kind of opting out of global capitalism?
I mean, I guess the other part of the question is a bit imaginative. It's like a part of a political imaginary of sorts, where if we understand the dissemination of music, for example, historically in Roma communities, I don't imagine that it would be based on the market logics of capitalism as it is.
It is, totally.
Oh, okay.
Roma historically have been professional musicians operating in a patron-client relationship. That's when they've sold music, that's what they've done. It's patron-client. But that doesn't mean there hasn't been Romani music that's community music that isn't sold. So that is non-professional music.
I mean, I do think there are some intersections, like, I mean, it's a little bit different outside of the Balkans. I mean, in places where there isn't that professional niche, because, like, honestly, nobody cares about most Romani music in, you know, places like the Czech Republic. So, I think there is that space which is kind of neither necessarily just community, you know, they are maybe trying to make some money, but they're not trying to be in the larger market, so to speak, but I wouldn't call it a project. I would just call it a way of being.
Well, for example, in Serbia, a very large Roma population in Serbia, and they are discriminated against as much as they are in other parts of Eastern Europe. But no Serb would have a wedding or a special ceremony without a Gypsy Orchestra or a Gypsy band. I mean, that's a patron client. So it's sort of an interesting relationship. You can hate them, but at the other hand, it's an integral part of your life celebration that without one, the celebration is not as quite as special as it is without.
I think there are some examples of what Hope von Bar calls counter-conducts within the musician community also, and it's the use of texts, some kind of subversive texts. If I remember correctly, the band Fekete Vonat, and even the name of the band refers to the black trains, Fekete Vonat, the commuter trains, which used to go from Eastern Hungary to Central Hungary, take workers back and forth. And I haven't really done a study of their lyrics. People here know their lyrics really well, but I don't. I think there are elements of counterconduct, subversiveness, which may reflect on capitalism and perhaps the power around it. But as big projects, I don't see anything like that.
And I think that, yes, there's many examples for the subversive counterconduct. I also projected Gallery 8, this small contemporary art space, which is located in the 8th district ghetto of Budapest. And there are actually district walks. This is advertised as the Harlem of Budapest, that tourists can take place. And Gallery 8 is a stop, and we are selling bracelets and really, crappy handmade stuff to the tourists who come to us, because the handmade things are made by old elderly women in the district who come to us, and also young kids whom are bringing their own ideas. So the gallery shop, so-called gallery shop, is not really developed into this like branding place yet. Yes, and it's really a tiny place because sustainability and these things are very important when we are an independent space without state funding. And there are several projects which are also, how shall I say, breaking off of the capitalist model. You can see these in social awards of the Erste Stiftung, which is an Austrian foundation. And for example, one of their awards is this handmade brick produced by it's a traditional occupation, Romani occupation, and it's a very trendy, sustainable building material. So it's helping actually the sustainability of a whole village in northern Eastern Hungary.
Okay, wonderful. So, it looks like this was a panel in search of historical and political concepts through which we can, usefully talk about the Roma diaspora. And historically speaking, in terms of Central and Eastern Europe, I guess the Romani people have been facing the challenges of nationalizations in the different country. And the way in which they may be woven into European history along other minorities is that it's probably not a coincidence that the exclusions of Romani in Romania was aggravated in the 1990s, when you can no longer speak about Jews as openly as you could in years before. And so there are concepts that perhaps are transnational that can help us talk about it historically. And politically, we were looking for ways in which we can usefully have a concept of Roma that we can speak about politically, right? And we were having difficulties formulating it. And I just wanted to call attention that strategic essentialism, I'm wondering whether we can think on how some of its difficulties is that, of course, the question is always who does the essentialization. And if we want to defeat the establishment that does the essentialization, our own essentialization is probably not going to be very effective. And also the question is then, what concepts do we have that enable us to tell the history of the Roma beyond the strategic essentialization? But it's not a surprise that we are looking for those concepts, because we are in the deconstructive mode, right? We are deconstructing power constructions of Romani throughout history. and we are attempting to look for some ways in which art can speak and do that part of the constructions. But we're still, I think, in search of concepts that would enable us to tell the story. And I'm so appreciative, that the panel shared with us the enormous erudition and spread, and shown us the diversity of ways in which different disciplines within Romani studies go in search for concepts through which they can help tell the Romani story historically and make it useful for political activism. So I thank you all so much, and thank our commentators so much.